Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video you are about to see is one in a projected series of 5 videos about the book of Daniel presented from an Orthodox preterist viewpoint. I'm going to try to show beyond a reasonable doubt that Daniel predicted 3 events in his future which were in our past. The first event was the arrival of Herod the Great. The second was the sufferings of Jesus. And the third is the destruction of Israel in AD 70. I hope you enjoy it. All right, the last video I stopped at verse 39, so I'm going to start at verse 40 here. Daniel 11 verse 40 says this, "At the time of the end, the king of the south will engage him in battle, and the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood." Well, theologians have tried to fit this with Antiochus Epiphanes IV. It doesn't fit him, but it fits Herod very well, except for one place where we have a translation difficulty, and this is a difficult verse. So let me just start out. Before I go through the verse, let's just deal with some of the characters. First of all, the king of the south here is referring to Mark Antony. It could be referring to Cleopatra, but the gender pronouns make me think it refers to Mark Antony. And because the king of the north is Octavian, the emperor Octavian, with a parallel there, king of the north, king of the south, that fits the so-called final war of the Roman Republic, or Antony's Civil War, which took place between 32 and 30 BC. It fits it nicely. So I'm going to say that the king of the north is Octavian, the king of the south is Mark Antony. Now, in the earlier verses in Daniel 11, the king of the north and the king of the south referred to respectively, the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic emperors. But here we have a shift now. We're talking about the Roman Empire, because the Seleucids and Ptolemies are gone. They're finished in history as the Roman Empire swallowed them up. Now, what is the time of the end? This refers to the end of the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom. As I've said in the previous video, it ended in 37 BC. The Hasmoneans were the Jewish freedom fighters who fought to purify the temple and to set up an independent Jewish kingdom, free, or at least semi-free, from the Seleucid Empire. Well, Herod took them over in 37 under the auspices of the Romans, and that's when he became king, and the Hasmoneans were dead. So at that time, right around the end of the Hasmonean kingdom, right about the time that Herod took over, that we have this big battle between the king of the north, the Roman Emperor Antony, and the king of the south, the king of the north, the Roman general Octavian, and the king of the south, the Roman general Antony, Mark Antony. Now, if you want to say that the king of the south is Cleopatra, that can be done, and some people do that. They say that she was the last of the Ptolemies, and all the other kings of the south in the previous verses in Daniel were Ptolemies. And although it says she's a king, the word basileus can be translated as a queen. It just means a leader or ruler of the people, according to Strong's or Thayer. So it could be Cleopatra, but I think it most probably, in my opinion, it refers to Antony. Now, let's look at this phrase where it says the king of the south, Antony, will engage him, referring to Herod, in battle. Well, now it turns out that the king of the south, Mark Antony, never engaged with Herod in battle. Never did. And most of the translations have the king of the south colliding with, or pushing against, or having a big great battle with Herod, or the subject of our passage here, who I take to be Herod. And that doesn't fit Herod, because Mark Antony was allied with Herod at the time of the battle between Antony and Octavian, which, as I said earlier, was 32 to 30 BC. So, what do we do with that? Well, let's look at that phrase, engage him. As I said, most translations have the king of the south fighting against Herod. And that doesn't fit Herod, who never fought Mark Antony. Philip Morrow, he has the king of the south fighting with Herod. He translates the Hebrew there as the king of the south will fight with Herod in battle, with him in battle. I also found another translation, the New Century Version, which has the king of the north, Octavian, fighting directly with the king of the south. The New Century Version says this: at the time of the end, the king of the south will fight a battle against the king of the north. Well, either way, whether you take Morrow's translation or the New Century Version translation, it fits Herod perfectly. Now, I'm not an expert. I don't know Hebrew at all, actually, and I would have to see somebody get into the Hebrew very deeply to show that these translations are unreasonable. I don't think they are. I don't think either one of these authorities are unreasonable, and I certainly would like to see the passage fit all the other parts of this passage, which clearly refer to Herod. So I'm going to take this as saying that the king of the south, Antony, will engage in battle with. So let's read this verse again. At the time of the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, the king of the south, that's Mark Antony, will engage with him. Herod will engage with Herod, will fight with Herod in battle, the battle of Actium. And the king of the north, Octavian, will storm out against him, Mark Antony, with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. Now, that's exactly what happened. Octavian sent a bunch of troops to Actium. Actium, by the way, is on the western coast of Greece to the north, actually in present-day Albania, and right across the Adriatic Sea there. Antony sent a bunch of troops expecting to fight a land battle, but what happened is Cleopatra talked her besotted lover into sending her fleet to fight a naval battle, which Antony was not too familiar with. He was not too familiar with fighting with ships, and he refused to engage in battle on land, and so he fought on a sea battle and got his fanny whipped. Here we have Octavian engaging against Mark Antony with chariots and cavalry. He sent chariots and cavalry to fight this land battle, and he also sent a great fleet of ships where the battle was fought. So far, the passage is fitting King Herod pretty good. Now, in this slide, number 24 here, we will see that Actium is here on the north of Greece on the western coast. This is in present-day Albania. This is where Actium is. As I said earlier, in that battle, Cleopatra and Mark Antony fought Octavian. Octavian came over from Rome. Mark Antony and Cleopatra came across the sea from Egypt. They met here, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra were destroyed. Now, notice this phrase, a great fleet of ships. I mentioned it earlier, but I'll mention it again. This is an unusual detail of this battle. There was a great fleet of ships, and the reason Daniel mentions this is because that's what it was. It was a big naval battle. And let me make a pitch for reading history. This doesn't mean anything to most people who have not read the history. You need to read the history of the Battle of Actium, or the final war of the Roman Republic, or Antony's Civil War, it's sometimes called. Read the history behind it, and this will make perfect sense. All right, now let's look at the last part of verse 40. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood. This is referring to Octavius, the king of the north, Octavius. He will invade many countries. Well, this is a matter of history. After he beat Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BC, Octavius then chases them to Egypt. Now, if you recall from the map, he could have easily just gone right across the Aegean Sea here, the Mediterranean Sea here. He could have gone right across to Egypt and to get them, but he didn't do that. He instead went through all of these provinces right here: Cilicia, Paphlagonia, Thrace, Pontus, Galatia. Every one of these except for Thrace is in present-day Turkey. And Thrace is on the northeastern coast of Greece, right north of Macedonia as you're going up to Constantinople. All of this is in the east. Illyria is in the central part of the Danube River, right around Austria, Hungary, Slovenia, those places around there. And Armenia is between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, going out further east. Africa, you know where Africa is. Well, all these provinces were in the eastern dominions of Mark Antony. Why did Octavius leave Rome, leave Actium, and go through all these provinces instead of just sailing right across the short stretch there across the Mediterranean Sea and go down to Egypt in order to chase Mark Antony and Cleopatra down and to beat them? Well, the reason he did this is given to us by Wikipedia. Octavian traveled by land through Asia. Antony had received much of his backing from Rome's client kingdoms in the east. By marching his army by land, he ensured Antony could not regroup and cement his authority over the provinces. So Octavian had a political reason for doing this. He was going through all the eastern parts of Antony's former kingdom in order to get political backing. Now, we go to verse 41. Daniel says this: he will also invade the beautiful land. The he is Octavian. What's the beautiful land? That's, of course, Israel. Did Octavian do that? Yes. After going through all the provinces I mentioned in the previous slide, Octavian then comes down through Israel, and he comes down through Israel on his way to Egypt, like this. And on the way, Herod entertained Octavius like he was the king that he was. And the reason Herod had to do that was because he had been on Mark Antony's side, and Mark Antony was now running down to Egypt, cowering in Egypt, about ready to commit suicide. And Herod had backed the wrong horse. He's in trouble, and so he is giving money, showering money, as we said earlier in video number 1. He showered money on the Roman emperor, as he often did, to get his favor. This fits the history perfectly, this verse here. Now we go on in this verse 41. It says, many countries will fail, but Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from his hand. Well, what does that mean? Well, what happened is that while Octavian was in Israel, he sent out some of his military leaders to capture the surrounding nations there. Octavian sent his general Aelius Gallus to capture these lands to the east of the Jordan River over here, Edom, Moab, and Ammon. That expedition failed miserably. Josephus says this in his Antiquities. I've got the quote right here. And a famous 19th century religious scholar, Christian scholar named Dean Prideaux, quoted the famous Roman historians Pliny, Dio Cassius, and Strabo, who said the same thing, that Aelius Gallus went to try to conquer these lands and failed. Now, this fits what Daniel says perfectly. Edom, Moab, and the leaders of Ammon will be delivered from Octavian's hand. And they were. They managed to win that battle. All right, moving along to the next slide here. The next two verses say this, 42 and 43. He will extend his power over many countries. Egypt will not escape. This again is talking about Octavian. He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Nubians in submission. This fits the history of Octavius perfectly. He will extend his power over many countries. Those were the countries that I just mentioned. The provinces of the Roman Empire, Paphlagonia, Illyria, Armenia, Africa, all those places that I mentioned. He extended his power over that, just like Daniel predicted. Egypt will not escape. He went down into Egypt, and he forced Antony and Cleopatra to commit suicide because they realized they were toast. And then in verse 43, Daniel says he, meaning Octavian, will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt. That's exactly what happened. In fact, Octavian's big desire was to get that gold, and he was scared to death that Cleopatra was going to snake it away from him. In fact, Cleopatra was thinking about putting all of her treasures, and she was a wealthy woman. She had a lot of money, a lot of gold and silver. She was going to put it on a barge and put it across the Red Sea and try to hide it over there in the Arabian desert. She decided against it. She hid it in a temple of Isis, and Octavius tricked her into revealing the location of the gold, and he got it. Fits the verse perfectly. He gained control of the treasures of gold and silver and the riches of Egypt. Just exactly what happened. And with the Libyans and Nubians in submission. Well, Libya is to the west of Egypt, and Nubia is to the south of Egypt. Did Octavian conquer those two countries? Well, actually he did. His subordinate Cornelius Balbus conquered Libya and Nubia. So Daniel fits the history of Herod and Octavian and Antony and Cleopatra just perfectly. So I do not understand why people insist on saying this passage refers to Antiochus Epiphanes IV or a future Antichrist. It does not, in my humble opinion. Let's go on to verse 44. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, referring to Herod. We're switching now from Octavian to Herod. Reports from the east and the north will alarm Herod, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. Well, what are the reports from the east? Well, if you remember, there were wise men who came from the east. They were looking for the king of the Jews. They showed up in Jerusalem. Herod heard about him, and he says, "You're looking for a Messiah? You're looking for a king of the Jews? The Romans are not going to like this. I'm the king of the Jews. The Romans named me king of the Jews. I don't like any competition, so I'm going to find him." Of course, the wise men outfoxed him, and went back to Babylon by a different route. So Herod, in great anger, he set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He went on and murdered all the little babies under 2 years old in Bethlehem in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. That fits Daniel perfectly. Now, those are reports from the east that alarmed Herod. How about reports from the north? It says right here, the reports from the north will also alarm Herod. Well, now Rome is now the power of the north. Remember, Octavian was king of the north. The Seleucids are now gone. And Herod's oldest son, Antipater, he was in Rome at that time. He gave a false report to Herod. He said, "Herod, your two youngest sons are conspiring to take over your kingdom." And Herod was a paranoid guy. He believed him. And as a result, because of the report from the north, he murdered his two innocent younger sons. Herod loved to murder his family members. He murdered Mariamne, his wife, and he murdered his brother-in-law Aristobulus, the high priest, and he also murdered his two younger sons who were entirely innocent of conspiracy. So he also murdered another son. So anyway, he murdered anybody he could think about. He was always murdering people. This verse fits Herod perfectly. Reports from the east, the wise men from Babylon saying that there's going to be a Messiah, and reports from the north, from Rome, saying that his two sons are about to conspire against him. So he goes out, he goes crazy, and he destroys and annihilates many in both of those instances. This passage from Daniel fits Herod perfectly. Now let's go to verse 45. Daniel says he, referring to Herod, he will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Between the seas, that's between the Mediterranean Sea on the northwest and the Dead Sea on the south. At the beautiful holy mountain, you know what that is. That's a standard expression for Mount Zion, the beautiful holy mountain, which is a standard expression for Jerusalem or Israel. So he will pitch his royal tents between the seas, between the Mediterranean and the Dead Seas at Mount Zion. Well, as a matter of fact, Herod had two palaces in Jerusalem. That fits perfectly. And then he says he will come to his end and no one will help him. Now, Herod's death is very interesting if you want to read about it. He had some kind of horrible gut disease. If you read his biography in Josephus, and there's lots of biographies of Herod, by the way, you should pick up one and read them. He had worms or something, just tore his guts out. His guts were coming, I think his bowels were coming out of his rear end at the end of his life. I forgot the details. They're pretty gory. But listen to what Farquharson, who was a 19th century theologian, said this concerning Herod's death. He was seized in his old age with a painful and loathsome disease, and suffering from the pangs of guilty fear, yet continued in a course of extreme wickedness to the last hour, seeking no remedy for his evil passions, but exhausting all the failed resources of the physician's skill to mitigate his bodily distemper and lengthen out his wretched life, meditating new crimes of matchless cruelty. And as a matter of fact, one of those crimes was he knew nobody was going to cry for him when he died. Nobody would weep for Herod because everybody hated him. There was a bunch of people in the Hippodrome nearby, and he told I think he actually gathered the people into the Hippodrome in order for his advisors to murder all the people in the Hippodrome so they would cry. If people weren't going to cry because Herod had died, they were going to be crying because the people in the Hippodrome died, and therefore he would get weeping at his funeral. That's what kind of a pervert this guy was. Fortunately, his advisors didn't carry out that scheme. But at any rate, this verse fits Herod perfectly. It does not, by the way, fit Antiochus Epiphanes. He did not die between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. I forgot where he did die. I think he died up in Antioch, but he didn't die in Jerusalem. So that ends my discussion of these very interesting verses, Daniel 11:36 through 45. I hope I've shown to you that they do refer to Herod. Stay tuned for the next video on Daniel, and we'll look at the famous prophecy of the 70 weeks.